Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the top 5 knitting beginner essentials. Now, it took me a moment to figure out what these essentials are. I think there are 3 main important ones and the last 2 are interchangeable. These are the things that I've learned as I've started knitting and what I recall starting with when I learned to knit. So let's get started. The number 1 beginner knitting essential is a pattern. It's very important to choose a very simple pattern to start out. There are many books out there that you can choose from that will have patterns. These are not beginner pattern books, but these are some of what the pattern books look like. I just wanted to show them to you as an example. I also like to print out my patterns and put them in a binder that I don't have books from, and that really helps me a lot so I can take out the pattern. And for example, this one I could just take it out like that. If I need to take it out of the sleeve, I can, but at least it stays all organized for me. Just picking a simple pattern. And if you need help with that, Ravelry is a really good option to go look for beginner patterns. You can even go into the filter section and they rate their patterns from easy being 1 to most difficult being 10. And if you want to focus on color work or other things like that, they have other categories like that. So picking what you want to make is very important. After choosing what you can make, then that can lead into purchasing the materials that you need. So I do believe that picking a pattern is very important. And if you can't decide, go to your local yarn shop and they will help give you an easy pattern if you're undecisive. There are many local shops that are more than willing to help beginners, especially because we've all been there before. Sometimes you don't have the necessities or the skills to know what you're even looking at when choosing a pattern. I think the lady that helped me out when I was living on the coast, when I decided to make a blanket. Now, I don't advise for people to start with a blanket, but if that is your passion, follow your passion. Do something that you're passionate. Don't let others convince you otherwise. I know that at the beginning, the lady did try to convince me, but she saw that I was very adamant about making a blanket. So she gave in and she took precautions when making the blanket. So she didn't allow me to buy all the yarn. She's like, here is this amount of yarn. I'll keep your yarn stashed away so nobody buys it. And then when you come back, if you come back, then we can go on from there. So I love the fact that she did that because she wasn't in it just for the money. So that was awesome. She actually wanted to show me, she actually wanted me to fall in love with knitting, and I did. And I'm glad that she did that because I was able to really take it seriously and be like, okay, am I gonna like this? Am I not gonna like this? And I did like it, so I ended up coming back to the store. And it's funny because I actually lost something. I'm pretty sure I lost my needle set or I lost something, and she was so willing to help me out and replace my needles and give me a stitch counter stitch counter. And that was just so kind of her without her, charging me. And so that just really already got me a great start to wanting to learn how to knit. So pick a pattern. If not, find somebody that will give you an easy pattern and that will be there every step of the way to help you. Picking a pattern and finding something that you're passionate about is very important. This is why this is the number 1 beginner knitting essential. The second beginner knitting essential is yarn. Yarn is super important when starting your project. There are different weights, there are different types of material used to make the yarn, And depending on what pattern you have chosen, the pattern will tell you what weight to use, what type of material, the yarn that they used to create the pattern, and the yardage to complete the project. So I have different yarns here lined up. Now there are more weights than this, but this will give you an idea of what the different weights look like. We have fingering, sport weight, light, worsted, which is medium, bulky, and jumbo. I personally like to make blankets with these because they knit fast. Before I started with, I believe, worsted or bulky with my first blanket, and although it did take longer, I am very stubborn, so I made it happen. So when choosing your yarn, it's very important to not just choose by color. If you need help, ask anybody at the store and they will help you find the type of yarn or the type of weight. And if nobody's there to help you, every single yarn on the tag has the weight and the yardage and what the yarn is made of. So even without help, they make it easy for you to figure it out. But I would highly recommend going to a knitting shop, just because they will shoot you to the right direction, will always give you tips. They will always want to try to help you. And even if you don't know what to pick, they will direct you to what they think is best. And so that will help make up your mind easier. It will allow you to take away all that extra stress that maybe you're not ready for as a beginner knitter. So this is why yarn is the second beginner knitting essential. The third beginner knitting essential. Now, after you've selected your pattern and your yarn, usually your pattern will also tell you the type of needles that you need and the size of needle. It will provide the US number and the millimeter size of the needle. Now there are different types of needles, there are sets. When I started knitting, I started with a circular needle and just one. And she told me to get this one because it would allow me to tackle multiple projects outside of just a blanket. And I still have these to this day, as you can see. I love these needles. I fell in love with the wood feel, and the majority, if not all my needles, are made out of wood because I just really love how wood feels in my hand. It's not like metal where you have to like warm up the needles or it's super slippery. Maybe one day I'll come to like it more. I would recommend either picking one singular needle set, whether it's circular or it's straight needles like these. Now these are really big because I use these to make blankets with that jumbo bulky yarn. It's pretty fun. I enjoy it. It's like a full body workout. But once you've decided that you like knitting, then I would recommend looking more into buying a set of needles, whether they're 3.5 inches or 5 inches long on the needle. I personally started with these longer ones, and then I bought a set from Amazon that I actually gave away to one of my friends because she wanted to try knitting, which was like 20 bucks. They were like 20 bucks, and they were made out of metal. They let me do things that I wouldn't have been able to do with just this one set. And I realized that I liked wood more than metal. It was a good beginner set because it allowed me to try and make other things. But then I realized that once I was committed to knitting, that I wanted to invest into something better. Now, these are both circular needles. These are double pointed needles, and these are just straight needles. There are different needles that you can use for different projects, and some are more versatile than others. For example, I really like circular needles or magic loop just because you can do so much with this. And like, let's say you have work on here, I can just slide everything down, throw it in my bag, and not have to worry about it coming out. Whereas, for example, straight needles, even skinnier ones, yes, you can scoot your work down, but you don't have so much of room between the tips and your work. And like, let's say if you put them facing down, your work will start sliding down and could potentially come off, therefore having some stitches off of your needles. And that is something that I did not like or feared that would happen, especially if I'm like carrying it with me to different places. So that's why you can get, covers, you can get stoppers that go at the end that will help keep your yarn on, but that doesn't mean that they won't pop off. So just a bit of insight there. So these are different type of needles. If you don't know what you need, talk to somebody, go to the yarn shop like I've mentioned before. They will be more than happy to tell you. They'll give you the pros and cons of each. But if you have a certain liking for a certain type of needle, let them know, and they can help direct you in the right direction. They can help tell you why you should and why you shouldn't, and then let you decide. But you are not gonna be held to one or the other, or at least you shouldn't be. I personally will give people my insight and then let them choose what they want to do. And also depends on whether you already have a stash of needles that has been passed down to you. So it might be easier for you just to start with straight needles because you have so many of them and they were handed down to you, and that is what you don't want to spend any more money. So that's completely understandable. So this is why knitting needles is the third beginning knitting essential. The fourth beginner knitting essential. Now, the fourth beginner knitting essential are stitch markers. Why? Because sometimes you just need to have the markers in order to know what you're doing. When I started out my blanket, I had to have markers. I had to have markers for the border of the blanket. Without the markers to tell me where the border started and ended, I wouldn't have been able to make a blanket because I didn't understand what I was looking at. So I couldn't tell the difference between a seed stitch, a knit and a purl. So even being able to look at it, I was like, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but at least the markers told me where I needed to change. So that made it easier for me. There are different types of markers. You have circular markers just like this that are closed. You got these type of markers that pop out just like that. I see a lot of people that crochet use these. Makes it easier for them. And then I have a little bit more fancy ones like this that are like birds. Here's another one so you can see that one. Super cool. And then my favorite ones to use are these little fox markers. Love these. I actually have come to find out that I like markers that kind of pop off and close. They like open and close. For me, that's just better. These are nice, but I'm not a big fan of like trying to like fight with it to go into its little spot. But these just, open and close, and that just makes things easier for me. I'm a big fan of foxes, and so that's why these are my favorite ones. But I don't know how many times markers have saved my life because I'm like, where's the beginning? Where's the end? Is that the border? Is this the border? And so it just kind of simplified things for me when I was learning to knit instead of being overcomplicated. And even now that I've been knitting for 3 years, I still use them. I would highly advocate for beginners to use these just because even now knitting for 3 years, I still use them. They still benefit me. They still help me. Even though I know what I'm looking at, it just takes away that added stress that doesn't need to be there. And I'm not saying that it's like super stressful, but it just makes it easier for me, and it's really not that much of a hassle to have them on there. So that's why I use them. Even when I crochet, which I don't very often, if I need to, I do use markers, and I like to use these open ones just because you have to open and you have to hook them to the stitch or the crochet to the crochet chain. So it's a little bit more different than knitting, whereas these are usually on your needles. So this is why stitch markers are number 3 on the beginner knitting essentials. The 5th beginner knitting essential. For the 5th knitting essential, I decided to choose a counter, or a stitch counter or row counter. It can be used for whatever you need it to be used. There are different versions of a row counter or a stitch counter. This is one example. So you just click the top right here. That'll count either the amount of rows or the amount of stitches that you're doing. I usually do it for the amount of rows, depending on the pattern. If it's not specific on how many rows you should be doing, like if it tells you knit up to 5 inches and you want to replicate it the same, like for example a sock, to match the other sock, you can count your rows so you know how much the length of the sock was and the brim of the sock was, and it can be very important to have a row counter. This is another form of a row counter. It has circular, kind of like a marker. It's got circular rings going all the way up to the center one. Is thicker than all the other ones, and that is number 5. So there are 10 circular rings going up, and usually I have 2 things hooked on here. Let me just take one of them off. So usually it just has one hook, right? So when you start out, you want to start out with 0, and that means that this one comes off as well. After you go through 10 rows, you hook or you latch this marker on the first ring. Now that will designate that you've done 10 rows. Now after you go up again and start over again, then you move your latch up 1 ring, and that will show that you've done 20 rows. So this is a more traditional marker and will still do the same job that this marker will do. Both of these go up to almost 100. This one goes to 99. This one does go to 100 just because it has the 10th ring on here. But they get the job done. Depending on the pattern that you do, you will either need this or not need this, or might need something else. This is why I mentioned that the last 2 were kind of interchangeable depending on what your pattern called for. Now I still think that this is a beginner essential just because we tend to think that we can remember everything, and after a while you realize that you can't remember everything. When you set it down and then come back to it, you might not remember what row you're on. You might not even know how to count up to your knitting needles to figure out what row you're on. So this is very important to have, because let's say you set your pattern down, come back to it. Oh, I don't remember what row I'm on. Oh, let me look at my stitch or my row counter. Oh, I'm on the 15th row. Cool. Let me look at my pattern. Alright, next row, 16, cool. Before, if you don't have it, you'll be stressing out trying to figure out what row you're on. You might not even be on the right row. You might add an extra row. You might take away a row. So this will also take away the stress of having to go back to the knitting shop if you find that stressful, and be like, I don't know what row I'm on, can you please help me, I'm so confused. Now, if that does happen, I will advocate you to go to a knitting shop, just because they will help you. They are more than happy to help you. Don't feel stressed. You will not be judged. If anything, they will commend you for coming in and being like, oh, thank you for coming in. I'm so glad you came in and thought of us first when reaching for help. So don't be afraid of asking other knitters. I've rarely, if any, had an issue with other knitters not willing to help or not wanting to give you some advice in one way or another. So don't be afraid to reach out. Alright guys, these are my top 5 beginning knitting essentials. Feel free to let me know if you guys agree or disagree, or what you guys would consider your top 5 beginner knitting essentials. Remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget, it takes balls to knit.